Now we're going to turn to an application of thinking about this issue, which is tax incidence. What tax incidence means is really who bears the burden of taxation. Incidence means burden. Who bears the burden of taxation? Now, technically, we have what we can call statutory tax incidence. Statutory tax incidence. That simply means, well, whoever pays the check bears the burden. So since this is a real person who's not an economist would say, gee, this is a stupid question. If I pay my income tax, then the tax burden's on me. If the gas station pays the tax on gasoline, the tax burden's on them. What's the problem? Well, they're describing the statutory tax incidence. What economics teaches us is that the economic burden of the tax can often differ, and typically will differ, from who sends the check in. Who sends the check in is not necessarily the party that bears the tax. And why is that? That's because the market reacts to a tax. Okay? This is where the economics gets a little more interesting. Okay? So that, in fact, we're going to cover 3 rules of tax incidence. Rule 1 of tax incidence is that statutory tax incidence is not generally equal to economic tax incidence. That is, the person who sends in the check isn't necessarily the person who bears the tax. And that's because of the market reaction to a tax. Okay? So we're going to have to define economic incidence. The economic incidence of the tax, we're going to define as the difference in somebody's resources before and after a tax is imposed. So the economic incidence is going to be the difference in a party's resources, either the consumer or the provider, difference in their resources before and after the tax is imposed. That's how we're going to find economic incidence, and that's the right way to think about incidence. Okay? Now you might say, well, isn't that just what I just described? Isn't that who sends in the check? And the answer is it's not, because when a tax is imposed on producers in a competitive market, they will react to some extent by raising their price. And the extent they raise their price offsets the check they have to send to the government. So their economic incidence will be less than their statutory incidence. Likewise, if a tax is levied on consumers, they'll react by buying less, which lowers the price. And therefore, the burden on consumers will be less than the check they send to the government, because essentially price responses offset statutory burdens. The price responses in the market are going to work to counteract the statutory burdens of who the tax is imposed on. So technically, let's define the consumer tax burden, the CTB, the consumer tax burden, as the price post-tax minus the price pre-tax plus the tax payment per unit. Okay? And for producers, we're going to define the producer tax burden as the price pre-tax minus the price post-tax plus the tax payment per unit. That's going to be how we're going to define the burdens. Okay? And we're going to put this to work now in an example to show you how this leads the economic incidence to be different than the statutory incidence. To see this, let's go to figure 3.4. Okay. These figures are now from the textbook I used to teach my other course, Public Economics. So let's start with the market for gas on the left-hand side of figure 3.4. That's a market with a well-defined demand and supply curve. Okay, as was mentioned by one answer here, demand will not be perfectly elastic. It'll be somewhat inelastic, but it won't be perfectly inelastic either. It's downward sloping with some elasticity. Okay, supply is upward sloping. As the price of gas rises, we produce more gas, and you're at some initial equilibrium. And this is sort of an 80s equilibrium with the price of gallon $1.50 a gallon and 100 billion gallons of gas being sold. So that's our initial 80s-like equilibrium. Okay. Now let's go to the complicated panel B, and I want to walk through with you what's happening. We're now going to impose a tax of 50 cents a gallon on gas stations. We're going to say to gas stations, for every gallon you sell, you've got to send a check of 50 cents to the government. And now, before you walked in this room, you would say, well, that means the gas stations are out 50 cents a gallon. Sucks for them. That's not true. Why is that not true? Because the market reacts. So what's the market reaction? First is the gas stations say, gee, I used to be happy to sell 100 billion gallons at $1. But now I have to pay 50 cents more a gallon. So if you're going to want me to sell 100 billion gallons, I'm going to need $1.50 to be happy. Likewise, at every quantity, the supply curve is going to shift in by 50 cents for the same reasons we talked about the last lecture. It's going to shift in. That means you're going to reach a new equilibrium. That means you're going to walk along the demand curve, because demanders say, well, gee, we don't want to pay much more for gas, but we don't want to go to we don't want to pay $2. We don't want to pay 50 cents. We want to pay $2 a gallon, so we'll consume less gas. And you're going to move up the demand curve to the new equilibrium at point D. Point D is the new equilibrium where the new supply curve hits the demand curve. We end up selling only 90 billion gallons of gas at a price of $1.80. Let me stop there. Any questions of how we got from A to D and why that happened? Now let's ask, what does that mean for our tax burdens? Well, with the price now $1.80, what's the consumer tax burden? Well, the consumer's post-tax price is $1.80. Their pre-tax price was $1.50. They don't pay anything to the government because the gas station sends them the check. So the burden of the tax on them is 30 cents. Think about that for a second. The consumer is not sending a damn nickel into the government, and yet they are bearing 30 cents of this 50-cent tax increase. Pretty incredible. Okay? That is the magic of the market. Look at the producer. The producer used to get $1.50. Now they get $1.80. So getting 30 cents more a gallon. But they have to send 50-cent check into the government. So they net negative 20 cents. So the burden on the producer is 20 cents. So you end up with this 50-cent tax being borne 30 cents by consumers and 20 cents by producers. That is, the producers may have sent in the whole check, but they don't bear the whole burden. Indeed, they bear less than half the burden in this particular example. It's obviously one particular example. In this particular example, they bear less than half the burden. So the party that sends in the check is not the party that necessarily bears the burden. The burden is defined by two things. One is who sends in the check, but the other is how prices react. And if prices react in the way they did here, actually, despite the fact the gas station pays the check, the consumer bears the tax, more of the tax. Okay? Questions about that? A little mind-blowing, I know. Take a minute and absorb that. Okay? But that's the way economists think about tax incidence. Okay? Is that basically the economic burden of a tax is not the statutory burden. Now, the key thing is the economic burden of a tax still adds up to the statutory burden. There's still 50 cents that needs to get paid. Okay? And we're going to call that the tax wedge. The tax wedge, okay, is the 50 cents that still needs to get paid. And you can see that if you add up what consumers pay, the consumer burden plus the producer burden, you get the tax wedge of 50 cents. That doesn't go away. It doesn't get hidden. 50 cents has to get paid. The difference is just how that tax wedge is split between producers and consumers. And generally, we will find taxes are shared by both sides of the market, regardless of who pays them. Okay? Questions about that?